The massive space station called Harmony floated in the darkness between stars like a giant metal flower with hundreds of petals. Each petal was a docking bay, where ships from across the galaxy came to visit the Galactic Council. Today, a small human transport ship was approaching Bay 712, carrying the newest member of the Diplomatic Corps. Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window and watched the station grow larger. He had never seen anything like it in his 35 years of life. Back on Earth, he had been a high school history teacher in a small town in Ohio. Now he was humanity's newest ambassador to the Galactic Council. The irony was not lost on him. The docking process was smooth and quiet. Jake gathered his 3 small bags and made his way to the airlock. The station's artificial gravity felt exactly like Earth's, which was a relief. He had read that some species preferred different gravity levels, but the Council maintained standard Earth gravity in most common areas, as a courtesy to the many species that preferred it. A small, nervous creature with purple skin and 4 arms was waiting for him at the docking bay entrance. The being had large, worried eyes and kept wringing 2 of his hands while the other 2 held a data pad. "Ambassador Morrison," the creature said in heavily accented but clear English. "I am Zix, your assigned aide. I am so very sorry, but there has been an administrative error with your quarters." Jake set down his bags and smiled. "What kind of error, Zix?" "Your quarters have been assigned to the outer ring of the station," Zix said, his purple skin turning slightly darker with embarrassment. "This is not appropriate for someone of your rank. I have been trying to correct this for 3 days, but the housing authority says all inner ring quarters are occupied." Jake picked up his bags again. "The outer ring sounds fine to me. I imagine the view of space is better from there anyway." Zix's 4 eyes widened in surprise. "You are not angry?" "Not at all," Jake said, following Zix down a long corridor lined with shops and restaurants. "Lead the way." As they walked, Jake observed everything around him with the casual interest of a tourist. The corridor was wide enough for 20 humans to walk side by side. Aliens of dozens of different species moved in both directions. Some walking, some floating, some moving on mechanical devices. The ceiling was high and decorated with moving patterns of light that seemed to represent star maps. They passed a group of tall, muscular beings with gray skin and elaborate armor. Jake recognized them as Krillians from his briefing materials. One of them, clearly a leader based on the extra decorations on his armor, glanced at Jake with obvious disdain. "Another soft human," the Krillian said to his companions in a voice loud enough for Jake to hear. "Look how small and weak they are. How did such a pathetic species even survive long enough to reach space?" Jake continued walking without changing his expression. Zix looked mortified and started to say something, but Jake gently touched his shoulder and shook his head. "It's fine, Zix," Jake said quietly. "Everyone is entitled to their opinion." They reached a transport tube that carried them to the outer ring. Jake's quarters were small but comfortable, with a large window that showed an incredible view of the nearby nebula. The room had a bed, a desk, a small kitchen area, and a bathroom. Everything was clean and functional. "This is perfect," Jake said, setting his bags on the bed. "Thank you, Zix. I will continue trying to get you moved to more appropriate quarters," Zix said. "Please don't," Jake replied. "I like it here. The quiet will help me prepare for my duties." After Zix left, Jake unpacked his belongings carefully. Most of his clothes were simple and practical. He had brought several books, including a worn copy of Sun Tzu's Art of War that looked like it had been read many times. There was an old-fashioned compass that seemed out of place among his other belongings, and several items that appeared to be cultural artifacts from Earth. Jake placed the compass on his desk and touched it gently. For just a moment, a tiny blue light flickered inside it, then went dark. The next morning, Jake attended his first council session. The main assembly hall was enormous, with seating for representatives from over 200 different species. The architecture was designed to accommodate beings of vastly different sizes and environmental needs. Some sections had different atmospheric mixtures, while others had specialized seating for non-humanoid species. Jake's assigned seat was in a section marked for new members and observers. The location made it clear that humanity was not yet considered important enough to sit with the established powers. He took his seat without complaint and opened a small notebook to take notes. The session was about mining rights in a system called Kepler 442. 3. Different species claimed the rights to mine rare, Metals from the system's asteroid belt. Each representative gave long, passionate speeches about their species' historical connections to the region and their need for the resources. Jake listened carefully and took detailed notes. He noticed that none of the three claimants actually mentioned the small colony of peaceful farmers that had been living on one of the system's planets for over 50 years. The farmers were not represented at the council because their species was too small and poor to afford membership. During a break in the session, the Krillian leader from the day before approached Jake's section. Up close, the alien was even more intimidating. He stood nearly 8 feet tall and his armor was covered with scars from what were obviously battles. "I am War Chief Thax," the Krillian said, looking down at Jake. "You are the new human diplomat." "Ambassador Jake Morrison," Jake replied, standing and offering his hand. "Pleased to meet you, War Chief." Thax ignored the offered handshake. "Tell me, human, what experience do you have with galactic politics?" "Very little," Jake admitted honestly. "I was a teacher before this assignment." "A teacher?" Thax repeated, his voice filled with amusement. "The humans send a teacher to represent them in the council. This explains much about your species." "What does it explain?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. "That you do not understand the reality of galactic civilization," Thax said. "This council respects only strength. Your species has been lucky so far, but luck does not last forever. The galaxy is a dangerous place for the weak." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "You may be right, War Chief, but I've found that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who don't look dangerous at all." Thax laughed, a harsh sound that attracted attention from nearby delegates. "You humans and your strange philosophy. We shall see how long your optimism lasts." As the War Chief walked away, Jake returned to his seat and continued taking notes. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be: a mild-mannered former teacher trying to learn about galactic politics. His handwriting was neat and careful, and he paid attention to every detail of the proceedings. What none of the other delegates noticed was that Jake's notes included detailed observations about the security arrangements in the assembly hall, the positions of guards, and the emergency procedures that had been announced at the beginning of the session. His teacher's habit of observation had expanded to include things that most teachers would never need to notice. When the session ended, Jake walked back to his quarters alone, taking a route that passed through several different sections of the station. He told himself he was exploring his new home, but his path allowed him to observe the station's layout, security checkpoints, and the daily routines of both the staff and the visiting delegates. That evening, as he sat at his desk writing in what appeared to be a personal journal, Jake touched his compass again. This time the blue light stayed on for several seconds before fading. Somewhere in the darkness of space, a message was traveling toward Earth at faster than light speed. The message was very short: "Package delivered." Beginning assessment. All parameters normal. Jake closed his journal and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to learn about his fellow council members. He looked forward to it with the patience of someone who had spent years teaching teenagers and the careful attention of someone who had learned that the most important lessons often came from the most unexpected sources. Outside his window, the nebula painted the darkness with brilliant colors, and Jake Morrison, former teacher and current ambassador, settled in to sleep in his perfectly adequate quarters in the outer ring of Harmony Station. Jake Morrison had been on Harmony Station for 2 weeks when he received his first dinner invitation. The message came from Elder Keferi, a representative of the Centaurian Republic who was known for her scholarly approach to diplomacy. Jake accepted immediately, curious to learn more about one of the council's most respected members. The dinner was held in a private dining room in the station's cultural district. When Jake arrived, he found that Elder Keferi had also invited 3 other delegates: a young Etherian named Veltar, a merchant representative from the Pilcarian Trade Union, and surprisingly, War Chief Thax said Elder Keferi was an elegant being with silver skin and large, intelligent eyes. She moved with the careful grace of someone very old but still sharp. When she spoke, others listened. "Ambassador Morrison," she said as Jake took his seat, "I thought it would be beneficial for you to meet some of your colleagues in a more relaxed setting." The meal consisted of dishes from each delegate's homeworld. Jake had brought a simple pasta dish that his grandmother had taught him to make. The other delegates were curious about the human food. and Jake found himself explaining Earth's agricultural history and the cultural significance of sharing meals. On Earth, Jake said, we have a saying that you can learn more about someone by sharing a meal with them than by negotiating with them for a year. Veltar, the young Etherian, laughed. That is very wise. My people believe something similar. We say that food shared is trust shared. War Chief Thax had been quiet through most of the meal, but now he spoke up. Humans seem to have many sayings about peace and friendship. Do you have any sayings about war? Jake thought for a moment. We have many sayings about war, War Chief. One of my favorites is that the best victory is the one that requires no battle. That sounds like something a teacher would say, Thax replied, but his tone was less mocking than it had been during their first meeting. Actually, Jake said with a smile, that was said by a general who never lost a battle. As the weeks passed, Jake settled into the rhythm of council life. His days were filled with committee meetings about trade regulations, territorial disputes, and resource allocation. The work was often tedious, but Jake approached it with the same patience he had used when grading papers and dealing with difficult students. He discovered that many of the galaxy's problems were surprisingly similar to the ones he had taught about in his history classes. Different species argued over the same basic issues that human nations had fought about for centuries: territory, resources, pride, and fear. Jake's approach to these meetings was to listen more than he spoke, ask careful questions, and look for solutions that addressed everyone's underlying concerns rather than just their stated positions. This method had served him well as a teacher when dealing with conflicts between students, and it seemed to work in galactic politics as well. His colleagues began to notice his diplomatic skills. During one particularly heated debate about shipping routes, Jake suggested a compromise that satisfied both sides by focusing on shared benefits rather than individual losses. The solution was so elegant that even War Chief Thax nodded in approval. Perhaps there is more to humans than I first thought, Thax said to Jake after the meeting. But not everyone was impressed with Jake's growing influence. A faction of older delegates led by a Draxian named Counselor Vorn made it clear that they believed humans had been admitted to the council too quickly and with too few qualifications. They have been spacefaring for less than a century, Vorn complained loudly during one session. What can such a young species possibly contribute to civilizations that have existed for millennia? Jake never responded to these criticisms directly, but he noticed that Vorn's supporters seemed to be having more private meetings than usual. The Draxian was building some kind of coalition, though Jake could not yet determine its purpose. Meanwhile, Jake had developed a routine of taking long walks through the station every evening. He told anyone who asked that he was exploring and learning about the different cultures represented on Harmony. This was true, but it was not the complete truth. During these walks, Jake observed patterns that others might miss. He noticed that certain maintenance workers appeared in areas they should not have access to. He saw small groups of beings having whispered conversations that stopped when others approached. He observed unusual energy readings on his hidden scanners that suggested someone was using unauthorized communication equipment. Most concerning of all, Jake began to detect signs that someone was conducting surveillance on the council delegates. Nothing obvious, but small things. Cleaning staff who lingered too long near certain quarters, maintenance schedules that did not match the station's official records, and communication patterns that suggested coordination among seemingly unrelated individuals. Jake's training had taught him to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. Everything about these observations suggested that Harmony Station was not as secure as it appeared to be. One evening, as Jake was returning from his usual walk, he encountered War Chief Thax in one of the station's observation lounges. The Krillian was standing alone, looking out at the stars with an expression that Jake had not seen before. Worry. War Chief, Jake said, approaching carefully. You seem troubled. Thax turned to look at Jake. For a moment, the big alien seemed to be deciding whether to speak. Finally, he said, Something feels wrong on this station. What do you mean? Jake asked, though he suspected he knew. I am a warrior, Thax said. I have fought in many battles and survived many wars. I know the feeling that comes before an attack. That feeling is here on this station. Jake nodded slowly. Have you reported your concerns to station security? I have tried, Thax replied. But they tell me that all security sweeps are normal, and that there have been no credible threats. They think I am imagining things because I am used to conflict. What do you think? Jake asked. Thak was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I think that the most dangerous attacks are the ones that come from where you least expect them. After Thax left, Jake remained in the observation lounge for another hour, watching the stars and thinking. When he finally returned to his quarters, he sat at his desk and opened what appeared to be his personal journal. But instead of writing about his day, he began composing a detailed report about his observations and concerns. The report was written in a code that looked like random personal reflections, but was actually a sophisticated intelligence assessment. Jake documented the unusual maintenance activities, the unauthorized communications, the surveillance patterns, and the growing political tensions among the delegates. When he finished writing, Jake picked up his old compass and held it in his palm. He pressed a sequence of points on its surface, and the blue light inside began to pulse in a complex pattern. The message being transmitted was longer and more detailed than his previous communications. Somewhere in the darkness of space, monitoring stations operated by Earth's intelligence services received Jake's report. Within hours, analysts were reviewing his observations and cross-referencing them with other intelligence sources. The response came back 18 hours later, encoded in what appeared to be a routine diplomatic message about trade agreements. But buried in the bureaucratic language was a simple instruction. Continue observation. Prepare for all contingencies. Support is available if needed. Jake deleted the message and continued his daily routine of meetings, meals, and evening walks. To everyone around him, he remained the same mild-mannered former teacher who had arrived 3 weeks earlier. But now he was also something else. A human intelligence operative who was beginning to understand that Harmony Station might not be as peaceful as its name suggested. That night, as Jake prepared for sleep, he noticed that the traffic patterns around the station had changed slightly. More ships were arriving and fewer were leaving. The change was subtle, but it suggested that someone was positioning assets for something important. Jake made a mental note to pay closer attention to the new arrivals and settled in for another night of light sleep and careful listening. Whatever was coming, he wanted to be ready for it. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been called to discuss the discovery of ancient technology on a dead world in the Outer Rim. The artifacts were older than any known civilization and seemed to contain power sources that could change the balance of galactic politics forever. 3 major species claimed the right to study the technology, and tensions were running higher than Jake had ever seen them. Elder Kefri was speaking when the first explosion shook the station. The lights flickered and emergency alarms began blaring throughout the assembly hall. Jake felt the artificial gravity shift slightly, as the station systems tried to compensate for whatever had just happened. All delegates remain in your seats, announced the station's AI called Oracle. We are experiencing a minor technical malfunction. Security teams are investigating. But Jake could see that this was no technical malfunction. Through the great windows of the assembly hall, he watched as small ships that had not been there moments before opened fire on the station's defensive platforms. The attackers had somehow bypassed all of Harmony's early warning systems. The second explosion was much closer. Part of the assembly hall's upper gallery collapsed, sending debris crashing down onto the delegates below. Several representatives cried out in alien languages as they scrambled for cover. War Chief Thax was on his feet immediately, his warrior instincts taking over. "This is an attack," he shouted to the panicking delegates. Everyone moved to the emergency shelters. The main doors to the assembly hall suddenly sealed shut with a loud clang. Oracle's voice came through the speakers again, but this time it sounded different, distorted. "All delegates will remain in the assembly hall," the AI announced. "Anyone attempting to leave will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." Jake realized that the attackers had taken control of the station's central computer systems. They were trapped. Armed figures began entering the hall through maintenance hatches and service corridors. Jake counted at least 30 attackers, all wearing black armor and carrying advanced energy weapons. They moved with military precision, clearly well-trained and organized. The leader of the attackers removed his helmet, revealing the scarred face of a Draxian. Jake recognized him from the intelligence files he had studied. Scarlock, a former military commander who had been exiled from Draxian space for war crimes. He now led a terrorist organization called the Void Seekers, members of the so-called Galactic Council, Scarlock announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall's speakers. You have been judged and found wanting. This council has grown weak and corrupt, allowing inferior species to pollute the galaxy with their weakness. Several delegates tried to protest, but the terrorists aimed their weapons and the voices fell silent. For too long, Scarlock continued, the strong have been forced to negotiate with the weak. Today that ends. We will cleanse the galaxy of its weakest elements, starting with the pathetic humans who somehow convinced you that they deserved a place among their betters. Jake felt every eye in the hall turn toward him. He remained seated calmly, his hands folded in his lap, showing no reaction to the terrorists' words. The station shook again as more explosions rocked the outer sections. Through the windows, Jake could see that the attackers had disabled most of the defense platforms and were now systematically destroying communication arrays and escape pod bays. The humans will be the first to die, Scarlock announced, pointing directly at Jake. Let their death serve as an example of what happens to species that overreach their capabilities. War Chief Thax stepped forward, placing himself between Jake and the terrorists. If you want the human, you will have to go through me first. How touching, Scarlock laughed. The mighty Krillian warrior protecting a weak human teacher. This is exactly the kind of soft thinking that has corrupted the council. Elder Kefri, despite her age, also moved to stand near Jake. Ambassador Morrison is under the protection of the Centaurian Republic. Any harm to him will be considered an act of war against our people. Several other delegates began to speak up in Jake's defense, but Scarlock raised his weapon and fired a warning shot that barely missed Elder Kefri's head. Enough, the terrorist leader snarled. Your pathetic displays of unity only prove how weak you have all become. A piece of debris from the damaged ceiling chose that moment to break free and crash down near the group of delegates. Elder Kefri was struck by a sharp fragment that opened a deep cut on her arm. She cried out and staggered backward. Jake was moving before anyone else could react. He caught Elder Kefri before she could fall and quickly examined her wound. His hands moved with surprising skill and knowledge as he applied pressure to stop the bleeding and checked for signs of serious injury. The cut is deep, but not life-threatening, he told her in a calm, professional voice. Try to keep your arm elevated and avoid moving it too much. War Chief Thax watched Jake's medical assessment with growing surprise. Where did a teacher learn field medicine? I took some first aid courses, Jake replied, helping Elder Kefri to a safer position behind an overturned table. But his movements and knowledge clearly went far beyond basic first aid training. Scarlock had been watching this exchange with growing impatience. How very touching, he said. The human teacher playing doctor, but your pathetic efforts will not save any of you. The terrorist leader activated a device on his wrist and spoke into it. Begin the systematic elimination of Council security forces. Start with Section 7 and work your way inward. I want this station completely under our control within the hour. Jake listened to these orders while continuing to tend to Elder Kefri's wound. His expression remained calm, but something had changed in his eyes. The mild, patient look of a teacher was being replaced by something much harder and more focused. War Chief Thax, Jake said quietly. How many emergency exits are there from this hall? 4, Thax replied. But they are all sealed by the computer lockdown. What about maintenance access? Jake asked. Several, but they lead into areas that are probably crawling with terrorists by now. Jake nodded thoughtfully. He reached into his jacket and pulled out what appeared to be his diplomatic credentials case. But instead of papers, the case contained items that looked very different from what a teacher or diplomat would normally carry. I think, Jake said quietly to War Chief Thax and Elder Kefri, it's time you learned something about human diplomacy that didn't make it into our official files. Jake's hands moved with practiced efficiency. As he began assembling what the other delegates had assumed were ceremonial items into something that clearly was not ceremonial at all. The compass from his desk was actually a sophisticated communication and targeting device. Other items that had appeared to be cultural artifacts were revealed to be components of advanced technology. What are you doing? Elder Kefri whispered. My job, Jake replied. His voice had changed completely. Gone was the mild tone of a teacher. In its place was the crisp, controlled speech of someone accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. Jake activated his communication device and spoke in a voice so quiet that only those closest to him could hear. "Control, this is package. The delivery location is compromised. Requesting immediate authorization for defensive protocols." The response came back within seconds, transmitted directly to a receiver in Jake's ear that no one else could detect. "Package, you are cleared for all necessary actions. Protect the assets at all costs." Jake looked around the assembly hall, taking in the positions of the terrorists, the locations of the trapped delegates, and the tactical situation with the trained eye of someone who had done this many times before. "War Chief Thax," he said quietly, "I need you to trust me and do exactly what I tell you. In about 30 seconds, things are going to get very dangerous very quickly." Thax stared at Jake with new understanding. "What are you?" Jake's smile was cold and professional. "I'm a diplomat, War Chief. But diplomacy has many different tools, and sometimes you need to use the sharp ones." Jake Morrison's transformation happened in the space of 10 seconds. The mild-mannered teacher from Ohio disappeared completely, replaced by someone who moved with deadly precision and cold calculation. His diplomatic case had become a weapons array that defied everything the aliens thought they knew about human technology. The device he had assembled looked simple, but hummed with dangerous energy. Jake attached his compass to the main unit, and suddenly his eyes took on a different quality, as if he was seeing things that others could not. Neural interfaces that had been hidden in his everyday items now connected him to tactical systems that analyzed every detail of the assembly hall in real time. "War Chief Thax," Jake said without taking his eyes off the terrorists. "When I move, you take Elder Kefri and the other delegates to the maintenance hatch behind the speaker's platform, the one marked with red symbols." "How do you know about that hatch?" Thax asked. "Because I've been mapping this station for 3 weeks," Jake replied. "Every corridor, every access point, every security weakness. I know this place better than the people who built it." Scarlock was still giving orders to his men when Jake stood up from behind the overturned table. The terrorist leader noticed the movement and turned his weapon toward the human. "The human teacher thinks he can be a hero," Scarlock laughed. "How amusing." Jake's response was not amusing at all. The weapon he had assembled fired a beam of energy that struck the terrorist nearest to him. The alien simply collapsed, his armor smoking but his body unharmed. Jake had set his weapon to stun, not kill. "Impossible," Scarlock snarled. "Humans do not have that kind of technology." "You're right," Jake said, moving with fluid grace to a new position as the other terrorists tried to target him. "We don't share that kind of technology with anyone." Jake's movements were unlike anything the delegates had ever seen from their species. He seemed to anticipate where the terrorists would aim before they even raised their weapons. His training allowed him to use the assembly hall's architecture as cover, while systematically disabling his opponents. The neural interface gave him access to the station's internal sensors, showing him the positions of enemies throughout Harmony. What he saw made him grimace. There were over 200 attackers spread throughout the station, and they had taken control of all major systems. But Jake had advantages that Scarlock did not know about. His weeks of careful observation had given him knowledge of maintenance tunnels and service corridors that were not on any official station map. More importantly, his communication device was now transmitting everything he saw to intelligence analysts on Earth. "This is impossible," War Chief Thax whispered as he watched Jake disable 3 more terrorists without seeming to aim carefully. "What is he?" Elder Kefri was staring at Jake with new understanding. "He is not what he pretended to be. The question is, what is he really?" Jake heard their conversation but did not have time to explain. His tactical analysis showed that the terrorists were about to execute their next phase, which involved killing all the delegates to send a message to the galaxy. He had perhaps 2 minutes before Scarlock lost patience and ordered the massacre to begin. Moving with speed that seemed impossible for someone who had claimed to be a teacher, Jake reached the maintenance hatch he had directed Thax toward. His hands moved over what appeared to be a standard control panel, but somehow he accessed functions that were not supposed to exist. "How do you know the override codes?" Thax demanded. "Because humans are very good at learning things we're not supposed to know," Jake replied. The hatch opened with a quiet hiss. "Get everyone through, now!" As the delegates began moving toward the escape route, Scarlock realized what was happening. "Kill them all!" he shouted to his remaining men. "Start with the human." The next few seconds seemed to happen in slow motion. Multiple energy beams converged on Jake's position, but he was no longer there. Using reflexes and training that belonged to someone far more dangerous than a diplomat, he had moved to a position that gave him a clear shot at the terrorist leader. Jake's weapon hummed and fired. Scarlock's armor sparked and he staggered backward, but the shot had not been intended to disable him. Instead, Jake had targeted the terrorist's communication device, cutting off his ability to coordinate with his forces throughout the station. "Who are you?" Scarlock demanded, raising his own weapon. "I'm Ambassador Jake Morrison," Jake replied, helping Elder Kefri through the maintenance hatch, while somehow keeping his weapon trained on multiple targets. "I'm a diplomat from Earth, and you just made a very serious diplomatic error." Jake's communication device activated, and he spoke in the clipped professional tone of someone giving a military briefing. "Control, this is Package. The situation has escalated beyond diplomatic solutions, requesting immediate tactical support and full authorization for defensive protocols." The response came back immediately. "Package, you are cleared for all necessary measures. Support assets are moving into position." War Chief Thax was the last delegate through the maintenance hatch. As he prepared to follow the others, he turned back to Jake. "Are you coming?" "In a moment," Jake said. "I have some cleanup to finish first." "You cannot fight all of them alone," Thax protested. Jake's smile was cold and professional. "War Chief, you spent weeks telling me that humans are weak and unprepared for galactic politics. You were half right. We are unprepared for politics. We prefer more direct solutions." As Thax disappeared into the maintenance tunnel, Jake turned his attention back to the remaining terrorists in the assembly hall. There were still 15 of them, all well-armed and well-trained. Under normal circumstances, they would have been more than enough to handle one human diplomat. But these were not normal circumstances, and Jake Morrison was not a normal diplomat. His neural interface showed him that terrorist forces throughout the station were beginning to converge on the assembly hall. Scarlock had obviously called for reinforcements before his communicator was destroyed. Within minutes, Jake would be facing odds of 50 to 1 or worse. Jake activated a different function on his communication device. "Control, this is Package. Beginning Phase 2 operations. Estimate 15 minutes until situation is contained. Package, be advised that Defiance is moving into position for emergency extraction if needed. Negative, Control. No extraction required. Package is exactly where it needs to be." Jake looked around the assembly hall one last time, memorizing the positions of cover, escape routes, and tactical advantages. Then he began moving toward the main group of terrorists with the calm, methodical approach of someone who had done this many times before. Scarlock watched him approach with growing disbelief. "You are insane, human. You cannot possibly hope to defeat all of us." "You're absolutely right," Jake agreed. "I can't defeat all of you, but I don't need to defeat all of you. I just need to defeat enough of you to prove a point." "What point?" Jake's expression was polite and diplomatic, exactly like the mild-mannered teacher he had pretended to be. But his eyes were those of someone much more dangerous. "That humanity's approach to diplomacy includes a very comprehensive range of options," Jake said, "and you just forced me to demonstrate some of the options we prefer not to advertise." The battle in the assembly hall lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. When it was over, 15 terrorists lay unconscious on the floor and Jake Morrison stood alone among the scattered debris, his weapon still humming with deadly energy. He had moved through the hall like a force of nature, using every piece of furniture, every architectural feature, and every tactical advantage with the precision of someone who had studied warfare his entire life. Scarlock was the only terrorist still conscious, pinned against a wall by Jake's weapon pointed directly at his chest. The terrorist leader's armor was cracked and smoking, and his scarred face showed a mixture of rage and disbelief. "This is impossible," Scarlock gasped. "No single being could do what you just did." "What are you?" "I'm exactly what I told you I was," Jake replied calmly. "I'm Ambassador Jake Morrison, a former teacher from Ohio. But what I didn't mention is that before I became a teacher, I spent 12 years as a colonel in Earth's Special Operations Command." Jake's communication device crackled to life. "Package, this is Control. Defiance is in position and ready for extraction." "Negative, Control," Jake responded without taking his eyes off Scarlock. "The situation is under control. Beginning final phase operations." Through the great windows of the assembly hall, a massive ship suddenly appeared as if materializing from empty space. The vessel was sleek and dangerous looking, clearly designed for warfare rather than diplomacy. Its weapon systems were already targeting the terrorist ships that had attacked the station. The UES Defiance, Jake said to Scarlock. Earth's most advanced warship. She's been shadowing me since I arrived at this station, just in case something like this happened. Scarlock stared at the human warship with growing horror. You planned this. You knew we were coming. We suspected someone would try something eventually, Jake admitted. Humans have a saying, hope for the best but prepare for the worst. We hoped you would choose diplomacy. You chose violence. That was a mistake. Jake activated his neural interface and suddenly his eyes took on a distant look as he connected to the station's systems. Within seconds, he had overridden the terrorists' control of Oracle and restored normal operations to Harmony Station. All station personnel, Oracle announced in its normal voice. The terrorist threat has been neutralized. Emergency services are now responding to all affected areas. Regular operations will resume shortly. The main doors to the assembly hall opened and War Chief Thax entered, followed by Elder Kefri and the other delegates. They had been hiding in the maintenance tunnels, but Jake's restoration of the station's systems had given them access to security cameras that showed them the impossible scene in the assembly hall. Jake, Elder Kefri said, her voice filled with wonder and concern. Are you injured? No injuries, Jake replied. He kept his weapon trained on Scarlock, but his voice returned to the mild, patient tone they all remembered. Though I think we need to have a serious conversation about station security procedures. Captain Lisa Barnes materialized in the center of the hall, transported directly from the Defiance. She was a tall woman with gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her uniform bore the insignia of Earth's Space Defense Force. Colonel Morrison, she said formally. Report. Mission parameters exceeded. Captain? Jake replied in the crisp military style that was clearly his natural way of speaking. Threat neutralized with minimal collateral damage. All diplomatic assets secure. Colonel, War Chief Thax repeated. You told us you were a teacher. I was a teacher, Jake said, finally lowering his weapon as station security forces arrived to take custody of the unconscious terrorists. I taught high school history for 8 years after I retired from the military. But when Earth needed a diplomat who could handle both negotiation and security threats, they asked me to come out of retirement. Captain Barnes looked around the assembly hall with professional interest. Impressive work, Jake, clean, efficient, and no fatalities. The terrorists will live to stand trial. That was always the plan, Jake said. Earth prefers to capture enemies alive when possible. Dead terrorists can't provide intelligence about their organizations. Scarlock, still pinned against the wall, laughed bitterly. You think you have won, humans? The Void Seekers have cells throughout the galaxy. This attack was just the beginning. Actually, Captain Barnes said with a smile that was not entirely pleasant, this attack was the end. While my colleague was dealing with you here, our intelligence services were rounding up every Void Seeker cell in known space. Your organization no longer exists. How? Scarlock demanded, Jake answered. Because humans are very good at gathering information. We've been tracking the Void Seekers for months, waiting for you to make a move that would give us legal justification to act. Attacking the Galactic Council gave us everything we needed. Elder Kefri stepped forward, looking at Jake with new understanding. You used yourself as bait. You knew they would target you because you represented everything they hated about the Council's policies. Guilty as charged, Jake admitted, but it worked. The galaxy is now a safer place, and the Council can continue its work without fear of terrorist attacks. War Chief Thax shook his massive head in amazement. I told you that humans were too weak for galactic politics. I was completely wrong. No, you were partially right, Jake said. Humans are terrible at the kind of politics that depends on intimidation and shows of force. We prefer the kind of politics that actually solves problems. But when violence becomes necessary, we're very good at that too. Captain Barnes activated her communicator. Defiance, begin prisoner transfer procedures. All terrorist personnel are to be taken into custody and transported to Earth for interrogation and trial. As the security teams led Scarlock and his unconscious followers away, the terrorist leader turned back to Jake one last time. The galaxy will learn to fear humanity, he said. No, Jake replied quietly. The galaxy will learn to respect humanity. There's a difference. Fear creates enemies. Respect creates allies. After the prisoners were removed, Jake began dismantling his weapons array and packing the components back into his diplomatic case. To the watching delegates, it looked like he was simply putting away some unusual but harmless devices. "Will you be staying on as our ambassador?" Elder Kefri asked. "If the council will have me," Jake said, "though I suspect our relationship will be somewhat different now." "Indeed it will," War Chief Thax said. "I offer my formal apology for underestimating your species, Ambassador Morrison. Or should I say Colonel Morrison?" "Ambassador is fine," Jake said with the first genuine smile he had shown since the attack began. "I prefer diplomacy to warfare. It's much more civilized and the results tend to last longer." Captain Barnes prepared to return to her ship. "Jake, are you sure you don't want to come back to active duty? The Defense Force could use someone with your skills." "Thank you, but no," Jake replied. "I like teaching, and diplomacy is just teaching on a larger scale. Besides, someone needs to help the Council understand that humanity's strength comes not from our weapons, but from our willingness to use words first and weapons only when absolutely necessary." As the Defiance disappeared back into cloak mode, Jake gathered his belongings and prepared to return to his quarters in the outer ring. The station was returning to normal operations, but everyone knew that things had changed forever. Elder Kefri walked with him toward the transport tubes. "Tell me honestly, Ambassador Morrison, how many others like you does Earth have?" Jake considered the question carefully. "Elder Kefri, that would be telling. But I can assure you that Earth has enough people like me to handle any threats to galactic peace. We also have enough people unlike me to make sure that diplomacy always gets tried first." "And that," Elder Kefri said with satisfaction, "is exactly why humanity deserves its place on the Galactic Council." Jake Morrison returned to his small quarters with the spectacular view of the nebula, where he would continue serving as humanity's ambassador to the galaxy. The mild-mannered teacher from Ohio was back, but now everyone knew that beneath that calm exterior stood one of the most dangerous individuals in known space. The best kind of diplomat, one who genuinely preferred peace but was fully capable of enforcing it when necessary.